The dividing line, when the levee broke. The air over western Pennsylvania in that scorching July of 1861 was not thick with moisture, but with a tension far more suffocating than any humidity. It was the silence of men who had stopped debating and started judging. Tom Everett felt it most acutely by the fence line of his family's farm. For 3 generations, the Everett property had abutted the O'Malley land. They shared a creek for irrigation, swapped labor for the harvests, and their children had grown up in the same dusty schoolhouse. Now, the split-rail fence felt like a fortified border. Tom, only 22 years old, but with the calloused hands of 40, drove his axe into a felled hickory log. The heavy thwack was the only honest sound in the valley, a sound of labor, not of grievance. But even the wood felt different now. He was chopping fuel for the coming winter, a winter he might not spend here. The O'Malley's oldest boy, Billy, sat on his porch swing, not working, just watching. Billy was a year older, a childhood friend, and now a registered member of the local pro-Confederacy Liberty Guard. He wore a faded homespun shirt and a sneer that had grown sharp over the last 6 months. The political schism had begun as a parlor debate over tariffs and states' rights, but after Fort Sumter, it had metastasized into a moral infection. The fight was no longer over laws. It was over who they were and who their neighbors were. Tom's father, a quiet man rooted by decades of toil, clung to the notion of peace. "Let the politicians break the country, son," he'd said just last night, his voice trembling over supper. "We break our backs on this land. That's all that matters." But peace was an illusion. The turning point was delivered not by a bugle, but by a piece of cheap, damp paper. A recruitment flyer nailed haphazardly to the general store's front post. It was titled in blocky, aggressive type, "To arms, ye patriots! The Union needs your blood." Tom had stopped his wagon to read it. The words were a fiery blur of preservation, duty, and the grave threat to the Republic. The rhetoric of the North, a battle for the very soul of the nation, was contrasted sharply by the whispers of the South, self-determination, homestead rights, and the fierce rejection of any federal yoke. As he stood there, absorbing the call, a group of men rode past, heading south. They were loud, crude, and adorned with hastily sewn red badges. One of them, a man named Silas, whom he knew to be a virulent anti-abolitionist, shouted a slur at the shopkeeper, a known unionist. Silas's eyes, wide with a fanatic zeal Tom had never seen before, locked onto him. "You looking for a fight, Tom?" Silas yelled, pulling his horse to a skid. "You looking to go north and fight for Lincoln's bankers?" Tom stood his ground, gripping the reins tight. "I'm looking to save my country, Silas. Looks like you're looking to tear it down." Silas spat into the dust. "This ain't your country anymore. This is God's judgment. Get out of the road, Yankee." The final word, spat out with venom, sealed it. It wasn't a joke. It was a sentence. That night, Tom couldn't sleep. The family cabin felt like a cage. He walked out to the darkened fields, the only sounds the chirping of cicadas and the distant low moan of a hunting owl. He knew the cost of his decision. If he went north, his father would see him as a runaway fool, betraying the land. If he stayed, he'd be haunted by the vision of a fractured nation, a silent partner to an institution, slavery, he despised, even if he owned no man. His duty wasn't to a flag or a politician. His duty, he realized, with a cold clarity that settled deep in his bones, was to an idea. The idea of a unified republic, where a poor farmer's vote mattered, and where freedom was not a conditional privilege. He reached the creek that divided his land from the O'Malleys. The water was low, a mere trickle, but the banks were muddy and soft. He stepped across the creek, a simple physical act that felt like crossing the Rubicon. On the O'Malley side, he turned back to face his silent, dark house. The levee had broken. The arguments were over. Tom didn't need to ask for permission or pack a trunk. He needed only his boots, his resolve, and his father's old hunting rifle. He walked back to the house, slipped into the dusty storage shed, and pulled the rifle from its rack. Its weight felt suddenly necessary, inevitable. The decision was made not with the cheer of a hero, but with the grim finality of a man stepping into a dark, necessary storm. He would go to Harrisburg tomorrow, find the Union recruiting office, and offer his name. He didn't know if he was going to save the Union, but he knew he was going to save his soul. Hard times a-comin', from farm to fray. Tom left the rifle back in the shed and walked into the house while the moon still hung low and bruised in the western sky. His father's boots, caked with the red Pennsylvania clay, stood sentinel beside the hearth. Tom knelt there, placing a hastily scrawled note beneath a boot heel, just 3 lines. Gone to Harrisburg, for the Union. I will come home. He didn't sign it. His father would know. The cabin air was heavy with the smell of wood smoke and old wool. He stood at the foot of his parents' bed, a silent, terrible farewell. His mother, small and frail, breathed shallowly. His father lay facing the wall, but Tom knew he wasn't asleep. The old man's silence was a judgment as final as a hangman's knot. "Pa?" Tom whispered, the word dry and rough. No response. "I can't watch it burn from here. I have to try and put the fire out." A moment later, a rough, low voice, devoid of any warmth, replied, "You walk out that door, you walk out of this life, Thomas. You're trading honest labor for a politician's lie." It was the final dividing line. Tom knew then that he would not only be fighting the rebels, but also fighting to earn his place back home. He turned, retrieved his knapsack, a small leather bag containing his Bible, a tin of dried jerky, and 2 spare pairs of socks, and slipped out, shutting the door on the man he loved and the life he was abandoning. The 12-mile walk to the train depot was the last stretch of country he would ever truly know. By sunrise, he was in the bustling, confusing reality of Harrisburg. The town was choked with men, horses, mud, and patriotism, a toxic, thrilling mix. Flags draped from every window, and the air thrummed with the sound of drums and shouted slogans. The Union recruiting office was not a pristine hall of heroes. It was a loud, disorganized barn reeking of sweat and stale tobacco. Men lined up in a chaotic snake that spilled out onto the street. Farm boys, city laborers, Irish immigrants, all united by a bewildering mix of fervor, desperation, and a guaranteed $13 a month. When Tom finally reached the head of the line, a man with spectacles perched precariously on his nose barked, "Name, age, profession." "Thomas Everett, 22, farmer." The man scribbled it down. The next station was a crude medical check. Tom was told to strip to the waist alongside 24 other men. A grizzled doctor, more butcher than physician, poked his chest, checked his teeth, and declared him fit for the slaughter, without a hint of irony. It was dehumanizing, the first strike against his sense of self. He was no longer a landowner, a son, or a free man. He was a piece of property, a body for the war machine. Then came the swearing in. Hand raised, he repeated the oath, a rush of legalistic language about defending the Constitution and obeying the president. He signed the muster roll with a borrowed pen. The contract was signed. His old life was officially liquidated. Within an hour, he was issued the tools of his new trade, a rough, ill-fitting dark blue uniform that smelled faintly of dye and mildew, a cap that gave him a childish look, and a heavy, brand-new Model 1861 Springfield rifle. The rifle was beautiful, precise, and weighed a ton. It was the only honest thing he now owned. Tom was assigned to Company C, 149th Pennsylvania Volunteers, the Bucktails, and crammed into a cattle car with 50 other recruits for the southbound journey. The noise was deafening, the smell worse. He was introduced to Charlie Rook Reynolds, a lanky, nervous logger from the Allegheny Mountains, and Sergeant Major Elias Vance, a career soldier whose face seemed permanently carved into a scowl. Vance was their immediate reality check. "You ain't farm boys no more. You're cannon fodder. You got 3 rules. Obey, clean your weapon, and don't whine. I catch you doing the last, you'll be praying for the Rebs to shoot you." The journey to Washington, D.C. was a rapid education in the Confederacy's shadow. As they moved south, the tension in the towns they passed grew palpable. At one stop in Maryland, a crowd of hostile onlookers gathered, shouting epithets and throwing stones. The reality of the enemy was no longer an abstract political opponent. They were neighbors, spitting in their faces. They finally arrived at a massive, muddy, temporary installation just outside D.C., a hastily constructed city of tents known only as Camp Misery. This was where the farm met the fray. Camp life was a constant assault on the senses and the soul. The food was salt horse, salted beef so hard it had to be soaked, and hardtack, flour and water biscuits that were often weevil-infested. The sanitation was appalling. Disease was a louder killer than any bullet. Tom, accustomed to the privacy of his own cabin and the clean air of the fields, found the communal filth and noise a psychological shock. He learned quickly that privacy was the first casualty of war. One morning, just 4 days into his training, the call came not for drill, but for action. A detachment of Confederate cavalry scouts, Jeb Stuart's infamous eyes and ears, had been sighted probing the outer perimeter. The order was immediate. Company C was to move out and push them back. Tom's pulse hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs. This wasn't a slow, tactical maneuver he'd imagined. It was a sudden, violent shove. He fumbled with his rifle, the heavy Springfield feeling clumsy and unfamiliar. Sergeant Vance screamed orders, his face a mask of primal fury. They ran across a field of trampled corn, the sound of their boots muffled by the mud. Ahead, the trees offered thin cover. Then came the sound, a high-pitched, tearing "Fah!" followed by a cracking smack as a bullet struck a nearby tree trunk. This was the first plunge. It was not glorious. It was terrifying. It was the abrupt, physical realization that a stranger, a man who felt the same fear and lived under the same sun, was actively trying to end his life. Rook Reynolds, running beside him, tripped on a root and let out a small whimpering sob. Sergeant Vance kicked him back up. "Get up, soldier! It's just noise! You'll hear a lot more of it!" Tom threw himself behind a low ridge, his mind a sudden frozen blank. He remembered his father's words, Silas's sneer, the weight of the Union oath. He lifted the rifle, sighted down the barrel at a movement in the distance, a horse, a shadow, and squeezed the trigger. The recoil punched his shoulder. The smell of sulfurous smoke filled his nose. He didn't know if he hit anything, but the sound of his own shot was a terrible, final sound. He had fired into the war. The separation from his old life was now complete, sealed not by a signature, but by a bullet. He was a soldier.
The long shadow of Antietam. The morning of September 17th, 1862, did not break. It was detonated. For hours, Tom Everett and the rest of the 149th Pennsylvania had stood in the pre-dawn stillness, packed so tightly with their comrades that the anxiety felt like a shared, suffocating heat. They had marched for weeks, tired, hungry, and covered in the dust of Maryland. Now, the quiet was replaced by a sound Tom would never forget, the rolling, concussive thunder of 1,000 cannon, a sound that didn't just deafen the ears, but vibrated deep within the chest cavity. Sergeant Vance, his face grimed with soot and looking suddenly ancient, pointed a bayonet toward a field ahead. It was a simple cornfield, the stalks tall and yellowed, promising a harvest that would never come. "That there is Miller's farm," Vance shouted over the din. They're throwing the whole goddamn First Corps at it. We go in on the left. Don't stop for nothing. Keep your line straight. If you fall, God help you." Tom felt the terror, a cold, liquid panic that threatened to make his knees buckle. It wasn't the fear of death. It was the sheer, overwhelming scale of the death already happening. The air was thick with the metallic tang of gunpowder and a sickly, sweet smell that Tom's farm instincts recognized instantly: spilled blood. They were ordered forward, and as the bucktails entered the cornfield, the world dissolved into chaos. The cornstalks offered no real cover, only the illusion of it, and the lines of men, both Union blue and Confederate gray, seemed to vaporize in the sudden ferocious crossfire. The noise was maddening. The whine of Minié balls, the constant crackle of musketry, and the terrifying screams of men struck down only feet away. Tom ran, his heavy Springfield rifle held close, his focus narrowed to the muddy boot prints of the man in front of him. He ran past men who were collapsing not from bullets, but from pure, shattering shock. He saw Rook Reynolds stumble, not from a root this time, but from a hit to the shoulder. Rook fell, clutching his wound and making a soft, terrible sound, the sound of a child lost in a crowd. Tom wanted to stop, to help his friend, but the irresistible current of the charging column swept him past him. He realized that the first lesson of Antietam was that a wounded comrade was already a ghost. They reached a point deep in the cornfield where the fighting became hand-to-hand. Bayonets were fixed. Rifles were used as clubs. Tom fired his weapon, the smoke blinding him for a moment, the recoil barely felt in his adrenaline-fueled state. He kept reloading, kept moving, kept firing, but he was shooting at shapes, not men, but shadows in the green and gold chaos. He had become a machine, reacting, not thinking. The climax came not in the grandeur of a heroic charge, but in a small, desperate moment of isolation. The Union lines surged, then collapsed back under a withering rebel fire. In the confusion, Tom lost his company. He found himself alone, jammed up against a low, moss-covered fence near a line of trees. His mouth was dry, his lungs burning, and his rifle was empty, the ramrod having snapped earlier in the chaos. He fumbled in his cartridge box, his fingers trembling and useless. Then, a movement. Just 5 feet away, emerging from the smoky haze, was a Confederate soldier. The man was young, barely older than Tom, with wide eyes, terrified, and a uniform that was torn and soaked, either with sweat or blood. It was impossible to tell. The rebel, seeing Tom unarmed and struggling, raised his own rifle. Time seemed to suspend. In that instant, Tom saw not an enemy, not a Reb, but a mirror. This man, too, was a farm boy, thrust into a fight he hadn't started, driven by fear to the point of killing. The rebel hesitated, maybe seeing the fear in Tom's eyes, maybe seeing the boy he himself used to be. It was the slightest pause, but it was enough. Tom, driven by an instinct far older than the Union or the Confederacy, dropped his useless rifle. His hand lashed out, grabbing the bayonet from the belt of a fallen man at his feet, a Union private he didn't recognize. Tom lunged at, not with a soldier's practiced thrust, but with a farmer's desperate hacking swing, aiming for the man's center mass. The rebel cried out, a guttural, shocked sound that was not a battle cry or a scream of pain, but a strangled gasp of life being stolen. Tom felt the horrifying, soft resistance as the steel found its mark. The young Confederate staggered back, dropped his rifle, and looked down at the dark, blooming stain spreading across his gray tunic. His eyes, those wide, terrified, mirrored eyes, flickered up to Tom's face, filled not with hatred, but with a profound, instantaneous understanding. A look that said, "You didn't have to." Then he fell, not dramatically,
but in a heap, like a sack of grain, silent in the mud. Tom stood over him, the bayonet clutched so tightly his knuckles were white. The noise of the battle, the cannons, the screams, the gunfire, all rushed back in a deafening torrent, but all Tom could hear was the terrible silence of the boy he had just killed. The moral burden landed not with a crash, but with a chilling, absolute stillness in the center of his soul. He hadn't shot a distant shape. He hadn't fought for an idea. He had stood over a young man and driven cold steel into him. He dropped the bloody bayonet. It wasn't guilt he felt, not yet. It was a cold, alien detachment. The war had demanded a sacrifice, and that sacrifice wasn't his own life, but a piece of his humanity. As the afternoon wore on, and the Union finally pushed the decimated Confederate lines back from the cornfield, the sun began to set. It set on a field of carnage unmatched in American history. 23,000 casualties in 12 hours. The ground was littered with the dead, stacked like broken timber. The cornfield, once a sign of summer promise, was now a ruin, the stalks chopped down by bullets, soaked in blood, its harvest, the bodies of men. He found his company later that evening, sitting shell-shocked beside a smoldering fence post. He looked at Sergeant Vance, at Rook, who was being tended to by a frantic field surgeon, and then at his own hands, which were now permanently, irrevocably soiled.
He was alive. He had survived the turning point. But the man who had walked away from the Pennsylvania farm, the man fighting for an idea, was dead, replaced by a darker, colder version whose only purpose was now survival. The long shadow of Antietam had fallen across his life, and nothing would ever feel clean again. The winter of ash and iron. The Army of the Potomac did not march into winter. It slogged. After the staggering waste of life at Antietam, the entire machine seized up, retreating into a state of suspended agony near Fredericksburg. For Thomas Everett and the 149th Pennsylvania, the months that followed were not a rest, but a prolonged sentence of cold, mud, and endless demoralization. This was the winter of ash and iron. They built a semi-permanent camp in a patch of scrub oak, digging crude, shallow pits and covering them with scavenged wood and canvas, their winter quarters. The earth itself seemed to conspire against them. Rain transformed the camp into a sprawling mire where men lived, slept, and ate in ankle-deep sludge. The fires, perpetually damp, gave off more acrid smoke than heat, coating everything in a fine layer of gray ash. Tom, however, felt the external misery less than the internal one. The shock of Antietam had worn off, replaced by a cold, calculating detachment that wrapped around his soul like a shroud. He performed his duties, drill, guard duty, fatigue duty, with the efficiency of a machine. He never spoke about the cornfield or the young man with the terrified eyes. He had successfully compartmentalized the trauma, but in doing so, he had walled off a part of himself. The sight of human suffering no longer moved him. It simply registered as a statistic. This was the true consequence of his first plunge into organized murder. "You look like you're carved out of stone, Everett," Sergeant Vance observed one dreary morning, tossing him a half-frozen piece of salt horse. "Better than being carved out of meat, Sergeant." Vance gave a sharp, humorless chuckle. "That's a kind of thinking that keeps a man alive in this hole. The sentimental ones go soft first." The greatest killer in Camp Misery wasn't the enemy, but disease and bureaucratic incompetence. Typhoid, dysentery, and pneumonia stalked the lines of tents with ruthless efficiency. The surgeons were overwhelmed, often performing amputations with dull saws and less than clean hands, treating common fevers as if they were divine plagues. Tom watched men from his company, strong farm boys like himself, waste away in days, shivering under threadbare blankets. Their deaths were quiet, ignoble, and far more frequent than those on the battlefield. Rations were the constant source of anger. The supplies were there, somewhere, miles up the supply line, but mismanagement and corruption ensured that the common soldier ate hardtack riddled with weevils or half-cooked beans. The food became a symbol of the government's indifference. They had answered the call for duty, but the government answered with moldy bread and indifference. "I signed up to fight the Rebs, not fight off lice and cholera," a private named Danny grumbled one evening, staring into the meager glow of their fire. Tom didn't offer comfort. Instead, he carefully chipped away at the dirt caked on his Springfield rifle. "We fight whatever they put in front of us, Danny. The Rebs, the cold, the hunger. It's all the same war." Tom's only anchor in this desolate landscape was Charlie Rook Reynolds. Rook's shoulder wound was pronounced clean enough, had returned to the company in early December, though his arm remained weak and prone to throbbing pain. Rook was no longer nervous. The terror had burned away, leaving behind a raw, cynical humor. They shared a shebang, a small, drafty shelter that was marginally better than the tent line. One night, huddled together against the freezing wind that cut through the canvas, Rook broke the silence. "You know, Tom," Rook whispered, his voice catching slightly, "that night back by the cornfield, when that Reb, when you—" Tom cut him off, his voice flat. "Don't say his name, Rook. Don't think about him. He was a job, and the job is done." "But I saw his face, Tom. I see it when I try to sleep. He looked like my cousin, the one that ran off to Ohio." He paused, shivering. "You got that look too, like you left something behind with him." It was the closest anyone had come to acknowledging the true turning point. Tom inhaled slowly, tasting the smoke and the ash. "I left the part of me that asked why, Rook," Tom finally confessed, staring blankly at the dark wall. "I'm here because I hate the idea of slavery and the idea of a fractured country. But that boy I killed, he wasn't an idea. He was just another poor farmer, fighting for a flag I don't care about. If I let myself feel anything about him, I can't do the next job, and there will always be a next job." This exchange cemented their bond. They were survivors who had traded their innocence for a grim partnership. They didn't talk about home, only about the immediate, tangible needs, finding firewood, scraping together a decent meal, cleaning their weapons. Their relationship was built not on friendship, but on mutual, necessary silence. As winter deepened into January 1863, the morale of the Army plummeted. Desertion rates soared. Tom saw men simply walk away, shedding their useless uniforms and disappearing into the woods, risking a firing squad for a desperate final chance at freedom. He understood the impulse. He remembered his father's words, "You're trading honest labor for a politician's lie." Now, surrounded by ash and iron, that lie felt crushingly real. They were freezing, starving, and dying in a muddy, forgotten hole, while the generals debated strategy miles away in warm headquarters. Tom still believed in the Union, but his faith in the war, the process, the commanders, the sacrifice, was draining away like water through the mud. He pulled a small folded letter from his inner coat pocket. It was from the farm, weeks old. His sister wrote of the failing crops, the lack of hands, and how his father never spoke his name but left his supper plate out on the table every night until his mother put it away. It was a silent, powerful plea. He hadn't written back. He couldn't. What could he tell them? That he was fighting to keep the country whole by becoming less than whole himself? That he traded his life of peace for a soul of ash? He refolded the letter, the paper worn soft from repeated handling. The farmer was gone. The soldier remained. But he knew with chilling certainty that he would either return home a hero or not at all. There was no middle ground anymore.
A reckoning in the dust, the price of peace. The walk from the depot was the longest journey Thomas Everett had ever taken. He hadn't seen the Pennsylvania hills in over 3 years, yet they were hauntingly familiar. They were greener than he remembered, the air sweeter, green of the omnipresent sulfur and death that had clung to him for so long. He walked slowly, his gait still stiff from old wounds, the worn Union coat slung over his shoulder, a silent testament to the chapters of horror he had survived. He was officially mustered out. The war was over. Appomattox was 3 weeks past, the air humming with an uncertain, complex kind of peace. But Tom knew the real war was not over. It had merely relocated, deep inside his own chest. As he crossed the final ridge, he saw the Everett farm. The barn was sound, the roof patched, the fields mostly tended. It looked exactly the same, yet to Tom's battle-worn eyes it was an alien landscape. He was no longer the boy who understood the quiet rhythm of the seasons. He was a man who understood the abrupt, violent rhythm of the cannon. He reached the house just after noon. His mother was the first to see him. She stood on the porch, a small gray-haired figure frozen in time. For a moment she just stared, as if seeing a ghost. Then she gave a cry, not of joy, but of a long-suppressed, ragged relief, and ran to him. The embrace was crushing, pulling Tom back across a chasm of years and violence. "Tommy," she wept into his shoulder, clinging to the rough fabric of his army shirt. "You're home. You're whole." He was not whole, but he held her tightly, breathing in the scent of lye soap and wood smoke, a smell that finally promised safety. The true test arrived a moment later. His father emerged from the barn carrying a bucket of feed. The old man hadn't aged, but his shoulders seemed heavier, his face more deeply furrowed. He stopped 10 yards from the porch, and his eyes, the same eyes that had watched Tom leave, settled on his son. There was no immediate word, no embrace, no forgiveness. "Pa," Tom said, his voice rusty from disuse. His father simply set the bucket down, the metal ringing against the stone. "You're late for the planting, Thomas." It wasn't an accusation, nor a welcome. It was a statement of fact, a demand for labor, and the only acknowledgment he was willing to give. Tom understood. The silent man was giving him an instruction: earn your way back in. The first few weeks were a living silence. Tom slipped back into the routine of the farm, swinging the axe, plowing the hard earth, mending fences. The physical labor was a strange solace. The repetitive, honest work of turning soil and stacking wood was a counterpoint to the chaotic, senseless killing that he had done. When the sun set, his arms ached, his back throbbed, and the exhaustion was heavy enough to keep the ghosts of Antietam at bay for a few precious hours. But the memories were always there, lurking in the daylight. The crack of the whip on the harness could sound too much like a musket shot. The smell of freshly turned earth could, in a moment of panic, conjure the scent of the hasty, shallow graves they had dug. And always the image of the young Confederate soldier with the terrified, understanding eyes haunted the edges of his vision. The unspoken weight between Tom and his father centered entirely on the dividing line, the rail fence shared with the O'Malleys. Billy O'Malley, the neighbor boy who had taunted him, had also returned, a gaunt, sickly veteran of the Confederate Army. He had lost an arm below Gettysburg. One sweltering evening, Tom was repairing a section of the fence that had rotted through. His father was working on their side, setting a new post. Billy O'Malley was on the other side, painstakingly trying to stack stones with his single good hand. The three men worked in absolute silence, separated by the flimsy rail of the border, separated by the memory of a bloody war. Tom finally broke. He stopped hammering, dropped his tool, and looked directly at his father. "Pa, I didn't come home a hero. I came home a killer. I saw things, I did things that weren't for a politician's lie. I did it because I saw a country tearing itself apart, and I had to choose a side or be nothing at all." His father drove his shovel into the mud, his eyes fixed on the fence post. "You left your mother," he said, the words heavy with pain. "And I came back to save the ground that made you, Pa. That's the truth. And I killed a boy who is fighting to take away the peace we have right here." A deep silence followed, broken only by Billy O'Malley's shaky breathing on the other side of the fence. Tom looked over. Billy met his gaze, and in his eyes there was no hostility, but only a shared, profound exhaustion. They were both victims of the conflict they had fought. Then Tom looked back at his father. His father finally looked up, past the old uniform, past the weariness, and saw the man his son had become. "The war's done, Thomas," the old man said, his voice trembling slightly. "But the healing isn't. The price of that peace is that we have to work harder now than before, to make this soil worth what was spilled for it." He didn't forgive him with words, but with a simple, profound action. He dropped his shovel, walked over to the creek that divided their property from the O'Malleys, and picked up a rusted, discarded shovel that lay half buried in the mud. He walked to the center of the rotting fence section, handed the shovel to Tom, and said, "There's a patch of ground that hasn't been turned in 4 years. Let's see if we can get a crop out of it before the sun goes down." It was the first time they had worked side by side since 1861. The old man's silence had broken, replaced by the honest, shared labor of two men, two survivors, who understood the true cost of their new beginning. As they turned the earth together, Tom finally felt the cold, hard knot in his chest loosen. The war was over. The work of peace, the work of healing, had just begun, one spadeful of Pennsylvania clay at a time. He was home.